All right, God is great. Let's call Proverbs, what is it, 14? Yeah, Proverbs 14 neutral for a couple of reasons. One, structurally, this is one of the chapters that to this point has more neutral verses, verses that don't seem to compare and contrast either righteousness and wickedness or wisdom and folly. And even in those neutral verses, those concepts will still come up. But 8 neutral verses in this chapter is kind of an introduction to, I think, maybe another 10 neutral verses in the next chapter as we move into chapters that almost exclusively leave that structure of compare and contrast behind, at least for the next few chapters. But beyond structurally, towards the end, a relatively famous proverb is going to remind at least me there are times when being neutral is actually a bad or disappointing thing because being too neutral or modest with the seasoning can simply leave food bland. And there are times in life when our choices can be tough, but they still need to be made. But first of all, let's look at a few of those neutral verses. First of which I saw might have been verse 7. Leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. Once again, not a compare and contrast between wisdom and folly, just a dedicated warning about staying too long in the presence of the foolish. Verse 10 reading though, the heart knows its own bitterness, and no stranger shares its joy. Going on to verse 12 though. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. Sometimes, like we say, the proverb preaches itself. Verse 13 will say, even in laughter, the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. Once again, going to the condition of the heart. It's not always obvious. Going on, though, verse 17 is going to say, a man of quick temper acts foolishly, and a man of evil devices is hated. Verse 19, the evil bow down before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. Going on, verse 26 will say, in the fear of the Lord, one has strong confidence, and his children will have a refuge. As verse 27 will say, the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death. And even though verse 27 may be the last neutral verse that I found, some of these verses reminded me of a famous comparison in verse 34, which says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people, which reminded me of that neutral verse where we said in verse 12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. And I think the reason that those two verses caught my attention is there are times when the way that seems right is simply sitting on the fence or remaining neutral on a contentious issue. However, Solomon, or the writer of these Proverbs, is reminding us in verse 34 that righteousness exalts a nation. However, sin is a reproach to any people. And even though, as we say from time to time, it can be awfully tempting to give into the pressure to turn a blind eye to the wrongs that are done in places where we just want to fit in, life does not afford us a comfortable place on the fence in every circumstance. And over time, if we cling to the fence in times when we need to make a clear choice, we can simply come across as bland. And so being neutral is not always a good thing, even though it can seem to be the safe choice sometimes. Once again, there is a way that seems right to us that can eventually lead to death. And even if it doesn't lead to the extreme of death, it can simply allow us to become neutral or bland by degrees, which might not seem too bad until we recall some warnings that Jesus and the New Testament writers give us about salt that has lost its taste and lukewarmness by the time we get to the Revelation, as he issues a warning to a church that has become lukewarm, neither hot nor cold. His reaction to them is spitting them out of his mouth, which reminds us that the wisdom of Solomon, helping us to understand that there are times in life when we simply have to make a choice, even though it is a tough choice. Once again, he is reminding us that failing to make a choice can leave us in places where we become bland over time because we are now occupying spaces that God refuses to fully bless.